Welcome to the Invite Health podcast, where our degreed healthcare professionals are excited to offer you the most important health and wellness information you need to make informed choices about your health. You can learn more about the products discussed in each of these episodes and all that Invite Health has to offer at www.invitehealth.com/podcast. First-time customers can use promo code podcast at checkout for an additional 15% off your first purchase. Let's get started.
Let food be thy medicine. We can date that all the way back to Hippocrates, the father of medicine, and recognize that foods really do make such a powerful impact on our overall health. And we can look at study after study that show just that. Today, I want to talk specifically about one particular flavanol. So this is a plant-based or food-based antioxidant that we can see so many benefits when it comes to our overall health. So I want to focus in on something that many people have a very big fondness for, we'll say, and that is chocolate. But I want to talk about specifically cocoa. So the cocoa bean and the actual powerful active constituents that are found within cocoa. So this is going to be the flavanols. We're going to talk about that today. I am Amanda Williams, MD, MPH, and I want to talk about the science behind cocoa and just how wide the spectrum of health cocoa has been studied in. And it's really quite remarkable because generally speaking, when people think of cocoa, they think of chocolate or milk chocolate. And this is not what we're discussing today. We're not talking about eating candy bars. This is not where you're going to be yielding your benefit from the actual cocoa flavanol. So I'm going to talk about all of those aspects, but I first want to kind of go and take a step back and look at why this matters so much. We know that there are so many studies out there showing the impact of having an anti-inflammatory diet and how this can actually reduce your risk for early death. There was a study that came out in 2018 that found that adhering to an anti-inflammatory diet was associated with a lower risk of dying from any cause, including cardiovascular disease. Now, this is really important because this was published in the Journal of Internal Medicine. Now, the unfortunate thing about this is that most of the time, doctors do not have the time nor the background to talk to you about the importance of foods and what foods you should be eating, what foods you should be avoiding, and why that matters so much. And you don't have to look too far to figure out why they don't know much about that. We know from surveys of U.S. medical schools that doctors do not receive nutritional training, but yet we know that the body is running off of these powerful nutrients, these vitamins and minerals and antioxidants. So it really is a sad state of affairs, one could say, that doctors are not trained to know this. So if you go into your doctor and you say, what type of diet should I have? They're generally going to use just the common one-off answer of, well, try and do a low sodium and a low sugar diet, low fat diet. They don't know enough about the actual science behind the foods to really give you the most scientific reasons as to why one would be choosing certain foods over another. So the study that was published in the Journal of Internal Medicine was looking at close to 70,000 men and women in Sweden who were between the ages of 45 years old and 83 years old. And they followed these folks for over 15 years. And what they did is they closely followed their diets, and they were looking at how closely they were adhering to an anti-inflammatory diet. And you say, well, what's an anti-inflammatory diet? Well, we have to look no further than the Mediterranean diet. We know that that is an anti-inflammatory diet, the most highly studied, most widely studied of all diets out there. Now, there's been diets that come and go, different fad diets, but the Mediterranean diet, that is the number one anti-inflammatory diet. So back to this study now. So we have close to 70,000 Swedish men and women, and they followed them for over 15 years. And what they found was that those who most closely followed and adhered to an anti-inflammatory diet had significantly lower risk of dying from all-cause mortality. And then when they broke it down to things such as cardiovascular mortality, we're looking at a 20% decrease in overall risk for cardiovascular disease just by incorporating anti-inflammatory foods into their diet on a regular basis. We're talking about fruits and vegetable, having things like tea and coffee, because we know that the powerful constituents that are derived from tea, like EGCG, for example. We know in coffee we get chlorogenic acid, which is very, very beneficial, not only as an antioxidant, but also in terms of the way that the body is processing carbohydrates. So there's a lot of ways that we can look at specific foods and narrow down how they are beneficial. And that's why I want to talk about cocoa specifically today. We know that there are pro-inflammatory foods that include your processed meats. We can look at all of the bad carbohydrates. So anything that has a laundry list of chemicals listed on a box or on a label, we know are foods that we should be avoiding for sure. And this isn't difficult. You can walk into any grocery store. If you pick up food that's in a box or in a can or frozen, and you see all of these different ingredients listed, that's probably not the best choice for you. You need to be choosing whole foods, things that we actually recognize, like that is an apple. I know that to be an apple. Not choosing things that is some modified version of an apple. So these are things that we like to think about. Now, there was another study that was done at Loma Linda University about a year and a half ago. And from that particular study, this was the red and processed meat and mortality in a low meat intake population. In this particular study, what they were doing is they were looking at close to 100,000 people, both men and women, and they wanted to see if their exposure to even low levels of red meat and processed foods gave them an increased risk for cardiovascular disease. And they found exactly that. They found that those individuals who consumed red meat and processed foods, they had a jump in terms of cardiovascular risk factors. And so when we look at those different markers in the blood, so we're looking at things like C-reactive protein, we're looking at homocysteine, we're looking at a shift in the omega-3 ratio, we know that this can be incredibly problematic. So study after study, we know healthy diet is linked to a healthy cellular aging process. University of Michigan, they published a study from 2 years ago in the American Journal of Epidemiology. And the key takeaway from their study was that following a healthy diet can help us maintain healthy cells and avoid certain chronic diseases. This is not rocket science. We understand this. We understand that foods can damage those end caps to your chromosomes, shortening the lifespan of the cell, doing damage to that cellular DNA. So this is why when we look at the science behind all of these different food groups, we can start to say, okay, so what is it specifically about these foods that are yielding so many benefits? So we look at cocoa. And this is one of my favorites because there is so much science behind cocoa flavonols and just how powerful they actually are. Now remember, we are talking about the actual cocoa bean itself, and then we extract out the cocoa extract from inside of that bean. Now, why does that matter? Because we're using that in its unprocessed form. When someone goes to the grocery store and they buy a candy bar, that is processed. So they're adding in things like fat, they're adding in things like milk, they're adding in things like sugar in particular. But when we just take the cocoa bean and we take the powerful constituents that are inside of that cocoa bean, those flavonols, this is where we really see this exponential shift in terms of health benefits. So the Journal of Nutrition back in 2016 was looking at cocoa flavonols and the intake of cocoflavanols in the human diet and looking at different biomarkers for cardiometabolic health. So we're talking about things such as CRP. We're looking at triglyceride levels, cholesterol levels. We're looking at things like insulin and glucose levels. And this particular study was done in conjunction with many different universities. So Brown University, this was also done in conjunction with Brigham and Women's Hospital at Harvard and the Chan School of Public Health. So it was a cross-university study that was actually done. And they found that the cocoflavanols can actually improve cardiometabolic health. So they performed a systematic review and a meta-analysis of all of these different clinical trials that were looking at the impact and the effect of cocoflavanols. And so they looked specifically, okay, let's look at this study that was done with cocoa looking at heart health. Let's look at this study looking at cocoa when it comes to cholesterol levels. So really quite interesting the way that they drew upon this meta-analysis. And at the end, what they determined was that the cocoflavanol intake had really favorable effects on cardiometabolic biomarkers. So looking at insulin sensitivity, looking at that cholesterol, all of those markers that they were detecting and saying, wow, just cocoflavanol alone was allowing for better response within the human body, which I just think is really quite fascinating. Now, there was a really cool study that was done about a decade ago, and this was in the Stockholm Heart Epidemiology study, where they found that cocoa and chocolate consumption, and when people had higher intake of those cocoflavanols, they had a really sharp decline in terms of their overall risk when it came to things like heart attacks, which I think is really quite fascinating. And within this study, that's what they determined. They said chocolate consumption was associated with a lower cardiac mortality. And this all came down to a dose-dependent manner. So those who had exposure in their diet to cocoflavanols on a more regular and frequent basis, they saw this really promising impact from that. So a lot of different ways in which cocoa is really showing its force when it comes to cardiac health in particular. The European Society of Cardiology, they did a study looking at how cocoflavanols could actually reduce a major biomarker that is linked with chronic heart failure. So these are not willy-nilly thrown together scientific studies. These are done through these major research institutions and universities, and the power of cocoa, in particular when we think about cardiovascular health, is really quite astonishing. And study after study looking at how it impacts blood pressure in terms of helping to support healthy blood pressure levels, looking at how it's impacting the inflammatory response, how it's helping to support, once again, when we look at the regulation of cholesterol and insulin levels. All of this is really quite cool. But then we get into brain health. And this is, for me, really quite fascinating. They did a study in England looking at the effect of flavanol-rich cocoa and doing this via a functional MRI, meaning when the exposure happens to the cocoflavanols, they looked to see what was going on within the brain. And they gave them these tasks to perform. And they found that when they gave them cocoa, and this was a group of healthy young adults that were placed into this study, and they found that when they gave them the cocoflavanols, they had this really enhanced lighting up of areas in the brain that helped with cognitive function, which is really quite impressive. I mean, just one study after the next. Then we look at how it may help to support skeletal muscle. And I kid you not, researchers at University of California, San Diego School of Medicine were looking at how patients who had advanced heart failure, along with type 2 diabetes, that when they gave them cocoflavanols and the powerful catechins within the cocoa, that this actually showed an improvement in mitochondrial structure. We know that the mitochondria, that is that energy center within every single cell. And so if we have mitochondrial dysfunction, that means we're not creating enough energy, which means we're not going to be functioning at our fullest. Well, there's no greater way to explain that than looking at someone who has heart failure. And those myocytes, those cardiac myocytes, the muscle cells themselves within the heart, are basically drained out from their ability to generate energy. And when they gave them cocoa flavanols, they saw this really rapid improvement in terms of mitochondrial function. So all of these studies looking at the way that cocoa can be beneficial throughout the entire body. Brigham Young University did a real interesting study talking about how the compounds within cocoa may actually help to delay the onset of type 2 diabetes. Now, is that not ironic when we think about chocolate and we think, well, how can chocolate actually lessen the risk for developing diabetes? Because we have to differentiate. We have to think of the actual cocoa. Now, keep in mind too, we're not talking about baking cocoa powder either. You're not going to go out to your grocery store and get, that's already been processed. So we're not getting the power of those catechins and those flavanols. So this has to be coming directly from that raw cocoa bean itself, which you can find in our Cocoa HX. This is an unadulterated cocoa bean extract, which is actually enhanced even more so with this wonderful fruit blend that really just helps to generate even more antioxidant power. So study after study showing its benefits when it comes to cardiovascular health, looking at blood vessel function, for example. The American Society of Nephrology looked at the power of cocoa extract when it came to kidney function. So once again, and this was published in the Clinical Journal of the American Society of Nephrology, showing just how helpful these cocoa flavanols can be to a struggling kidney. And remember, our kidneys are pretty darn important in terms of filtration, in terms of being able to get rid of waste. We don't want waste buildup in the body. That's certainly not something that we should ever be striving for. And looking at it when it comes to brain health, that is really, really interesting too. These functional MRI studies, the one that I mentioned in England, they did one at Columbia University Medical School showing how those cocoa flavanols can actually reverse age-related memory decline. So you may think to yourself, okay, so maybe having a scoop of Cocoa HX every day would be a good idea. By all means, I certainly encourage it. There is so much scientific evidence behind cocoa that really shows just how advantageous this can be when we look at cocoa and how it can actually work in terms of reducing stress and inflammation. This was a study, once again, from Loma Linda University showing that those cocoa flavanols and consuming those on a regular basis actually reduced stress and inflammation, at the same time improved memory, immunity, and mood. So study after study continuously reinforces why cocoa is kind of like a superfood in and of itself. So I certainly encourage you to go to our website and check out our Cocoa HX. This is a great thing. I like to add it in to yogurt. So I'll use just a plain, not any of those weird yogurts that you can find out there that have, Oreos and different things, Skittles put into them. We're talking plain yogurt. Organic would be the ideal way to go with that. And then I like to add in 1 scoop of the Cocoa HX to that. But you can do the Cocoa HX in, just with some coconut milk, for example. You can add it in and just have it as a hot drink. That's another way. We've got some really cool recipes on our website utilizing cocoa. So some fun ways for you to use the Cocoa HX as part of not only your supplementation routine, but as part of your diet. So definitely go to the website and check that out. That is all that I have for you for today. I want to thank you so much for tuning into the Invite Health podcast. Remember, you can find all of our episodes for free wherever you listen to podcasts or by visiting invitehealth.com/podcast. Now, do make sure that you subscribe and you leave us a review. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Invite Health, and we will see you next time for another episode of the Invite Health podcast.